In this section, I want to have a look at a common lab test of procedural memory. Or sometimes in this context it's called implicit memory, and have a look at the information mechanisms that support this phenomenon. And this test is called letter string recognition. And in the test, subjects are shown a series of letter strings. Some are real words, some are non-words, but the letters linguistically could be a word. And the subjects are asked to push a button to indicate as rapidly as possible whether a letter string is a word or a non-word. It takes about 600 milliseconds to identify a word and 700 milliseconds to identify a non-word. If a word is seen again a short time later, response is about 100 milliseconds faster, and a repeated non-word also results in a faster response. And the fast response can persist for days in some cases. We've talked quite a lot earlier in the course about learning the meaning of words under semantic memory. But as a quick reminder, hearing a word like a bird results in direct activation of auditory columns, which, acting via an intermediate cortical area, can indirectly activate visual columns that have often been active at the same time as the auditory columns, which will create a pseudo-visual image of a bird. So, a real word produces a strong indirect activation in visual areas, but a non-word like mewed, for example, will only generate a very weak visual indirect activation. So this gives a way for the brain to discriminate between words and non-words. In the case of a word that's read, the visual column population, directly activated by seeing the word, indirectly activates a population similar to the ones active when seeing the corresponding word in the past. So again, for a non-word, this secondary population will be negligible. So to understand the process when responding to visually presented words, we'll use a simplified model. We'll get to a somewhat more realistic model when we talk about speech processing later on. The very simplified model has a visual area and an area that detects the activity of groups of columns in the visual area that have often been active in the past at the same time, and columns in this second intermediate area drive indirect activation of a secondary population back in the visual area. Visual columns often active in the past just before or just after the columns in the intermediate area. In this very simplified model, the brain might acquire these types of receptive fields by seeing the word and shortly afterwards seeing a picture of the corresponding object. Then there's an area that detects receptive fields able to discriminate between a situation in which there's strong activity in the visual area at two phases of modulation, and a situation in which there's strong activity only at one phase of modulation. Suppose there are two behavioral components, one driving motor movements to press the word button, the other to press the non-word button. These components, of course, will be located in the striatum. Let's also suppose that these two components get inputs from the discriminate relative activation area. Using these relative activation receptor fields would have been used to discriminate between real and non-words in the past. So these recommendation strengths can be established rapidly when the task is explained. Suppose there are also reward components that can increase or decrease recommendation strengths appropriately. Now, think about the sequence of information processes in viewing one letter string. The first step is indirect activation of receptive fields in response to the visual inputs. The second step is detection of receptive fields corresponding with groups of visual columns often active at the same time, followed by indirect activation of a second population in the visual area that I've illustrated in pink to communicate that it's at a different phase of modulation. Then the outputs from the two populations are synchronized and released to the relative activation area, where they drive some receptive field detections that generally have appropriate recommendation strengths to select the right response. The recommendation strengths that generated the selective behavior are therefore increased. The time to generate behavior is therefore the time to generate a sequence of column populations: direct visual, often active at the same time in the past; indirect visual; relative activation, after which receptive fields arrive at the behavioral components, and that largely determines the response time. So how could the response time be shortened? Well, remember that the reward component increases the weights of any synapses onto the selected behavior, provided they're getting inputs. Suppose there's some connectivity directly from the visual area to the behavioral components. The weights of these synapses will be increased, so the recommendation strengths of those visual receptive fields in favor of the appropriate behavior will also be increased. And those recommendation strengths will be available to components a little earlier than those derived from the relative activation area. So the increase in these recommendation strengths after a letter string is seen for the first time means that the response will be a little faster the second time.